Today, we're going to talk about psychology, the science of behavior. Now, this chapter is going to be a pretty broad overview of psychology as a whole, some of the history of psychology and how we've got to where we are in the field now, as well as a couple of the terms and ideas that we're going to need throughout the rest of the course. So, at the beginning, for each chapter, I usually start with a couple of definitions. And so here, we'll start with the most basic of those for this course, which is, what is psychology? And so psychology is going to be the scientific study of behavior and the mind. And we can talk about behavior as things that are actions and responses, things that are directly observable. So some of the things that you might think of as normal to study in psychology. So you could look at, say, a person making a choice in a grocery store. Which brand do they prefer to buy from? A dog sitting on command, or maybe somebody doing an action in response to some kind of external force. The mind is the part of psychology that tends to hold people up. Our mind is our internal state and processes. It's the internal stuff, things that are quite a bit harder to try and observe directly. So when we talk about the mind, we could talk about things like thoughts and feelings, and it's really hard to get something measurable and concrete out of that. So you can't measure what someone is thinking or how they are coming to a decision or even what they're focusing on at any one given moment. So when we're studying behavior and the mind, it's difficult because one of those things is quite a bit easier to study than the other. And we'll get into some of those challenges as we work through the course. And so we're going to start off by talking about two broad categories of research. And this isn't specific to psychology, this is sort of all kinds of science. And we can divide research into either basic or applied. And so basic knowledge or basic research is research that's seeking knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I want to learn more about X. Whereas applied research is something where you're trying to answer a specific question. You're trying to find a solution to a particular problem. So I need to learn more about X so that I can solve problem Y. And so I have some examples here, and I'm going to make use of my love of cephalopods. And so we could have our basic research is when people start studying, say here we have, I think that's it's a cuttlefish. I was trying to remember which picture I used. You can use a cuttlefish, or I've seen research looking at nautiluses. And people are pretty much in the dark about a lot of their biological functions. So a lot of cephalopods have mysterious eyes that lack lenses. And so there's the Queensland Brain Institute, and their whole goal is to try and figure out how cephalopods might see their world. So this is basic research because they just want to know how it works. They have no idea how cephalopods can have eyes that don't have lenses, but that they still have really good visual systems. They can make visual discriminations, and they're actually really good at it. So that's some basic knowledge, and I included a link here just because I find it's interesting, not because you have to go learn about cephalopods. For applied research, staying on the cephalopod track, there is another group, the Octopus Project, and they've been looking at how octopi, or octopuses, I suppose is the correct plural, how octopuses use their tentacles, how they manipulate things in their environment. And they want to know this so that they can actually build a robot. They want to build a robot that could be used in underwater search, rescue, and exploration. So here's one of their prototypes where they've built this robotic arm modeled after a robot, or after an octopus's arm. And so this is applied research because they're learning more about octopuses specifically to create something to solve another problem. And so from there, we're going to move into a little bit more general information about psychology. So if you follow along in the textbook spends a lot of time talking about the subfields in psychology and where the field is standing right now and all the overlaps that it has with other things. And I want to tell you right now that I'm giving you this information to give you an idea of what you could do if you study psychology. I want to give you some information about what psychology is and how it works and what people do who are psychologists, not because I want you to memorize these lists of things. I'm not going to ask you an exam question about what are the 7 subfields within psychology. That's not the point of this. So take from the next couple of slides that I'm giving you this information so that you understand that psychology is a broad and varied field, not that this is something you need to memorize. And so with that said, psychology is, in fact, a broad and varied field. There are tons of subfields within psychology, specifically 7 listed here, but psychology is a constantly evolving and changing discipline. So there's always stuff being added and changed and modified, and people don't agree on categories, but these are what we're going to talk about. So if you wanted to get into psychology, you could go into clinical psychology. And this is what most people think about when you say you're studying psychology. This is people who are concerned with studying and treating mental disorders. So they could diagnose people, they could deal with patients, that sort of thing. We could also have cognitive psychology, and this is one of the fields that I tend to overlap with. So I'll drop some bits of information about my areas of study as we go through the course. But cognitive psychology looks at mental processes. So consciousness and attention and memory and decision making and problem solving. My area of cognitive psychology looks at category formation in songbirds and how it relates to communication. You could also go into biopsychology or neuroscience, so overlapping with biology and neuroscience. So you could study the biological underpinnings of behavior. So what's going on in the brain, in the genes, in the hormones within the body that's driving behavior. You could also go into developmental psychology, which focuses on how humans change across their lifespan. Industrial organizational psychology is an interesting one, which is where you actually apply psychology specifically to a workplace. So you could go into office buildings and maybe warn employers that their environment is going to be bad for their workers' mental health or things like that. Try and help improve job satisfaction and motivation and performance. Personality psychology is kind of like what it sounds like. You're going to study personality in humans. Try and figure out what traits are driving individual personality. Or you can go into social psychology, so looking at how people influence other people. Lots of ways that psychology can be used. And again, this isn't a completely exhaustive list. It's just giving you a taste for how diverse this field can be. And so like we said, lots of subfields within the discipline, and a lot of topics end up crossing over with other fields of psychology, but also with other sciences. And sometimes you can look at a topic from a lot of different directions. So whether you're biologically minded or psychologically minded or whatever, lots of overlap, lots of multidisciplinary approaches. And like I said, lots of new stuff is popping up all the time because we're studying humans, and as we learn more, we have different fields created, or sometimes you just call it something new. So if you see somebody talking about a field of psychology that we haven't mentioned, it might be a new one, or it might just be a different name for one of the others. And this is a visual representation of how psychology can exist at this intersection between all sorts of other fields. So we've already mentioned biology, but you could make the connection that psych would overlap with medicine, sometimes even computer science and engineering, definitely sociology, economics, anthropology. All of these can sort of relate to one another. You can see some crossover, and that lets biology become this very interdisciplinary field where you can work with a lot of people from other areas. All right, so our next section is going to talk a little bit about some of the major themes in psychology and some of the main ideas that we want to start carrying through this course. So again, I don't want you to memorize the 7 major themes in psychology, but these are things that you should keep in mind as we move through different topics throughout the course. So the first major theme is that psychology is empirical. And this just means that we're going to be acquiring knowledge through observation. So as a science, psychology is based on observing the environment around us and starting to try and make some conclusions and connections, attaining knowledge. Psychology is going to be theoretically diverse. So we have lots of theories and they have lots of different ideas about how things work. So we can take this empirical knowledge that we've gained and start connecting it with theories. And theories are going to link different ideas and observations together in a way that's trying to explain the world around us. So again, as science does, we're building up what we know and starting to try and make some connections. We should also keep in mind that psychology evolves in a socio-historical context. And what this means is that psychology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's going to be affected by things that have happened in the past, historically, and socially. So things that are going on now in society can influence psychology. So psychology can be affected by trends, issues, and values within a society. And in turn, psychology can then influence some of those trends and values. So as we learn more information, we can shape our society, and what society is interested in can shape what psychology is looking at. It's a balancing act. So again, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and we have to keep in mind what we're looking at and why. The next point is that behavior is determined by multiple causes. It's not just you're doing a behavior because of this one thing. We have to consider the biology behind it. So maybe you're lifting your arm because the neurons that control that action are firing. And maybe they're firing because your brain has told those neurons to fire. And that direction to fire has come from some kind of external force, and so on and so forth. So you can consider lots of different things that are affecting behavior. And we'll come back to a lot of these topics in detail as we go on. But again, just something to keep in the back of your mind as we go through the course. Similar to number 3, behavior is also shaped by cultural heritage. So culture, which is our shared customs, beliefs, values, and things like that, can start affecting how we behave and why. So a cultural norm, sort of a standard of how to behave in a given situation, will tell us if it is okay to behave a certain way in a certain situation. And we'll talk more about cultural norms later, but the quickest example is in some cultures, it is not okay to cry. It's not okay to show that strong emotion. And so even if you are really sad and you get some really bad news at work, your culture will tell you that you can't cry at work and you would have to find somewhere private to express that emotion. So your behavior is changed based on what your culture decrees as normal behavior, which is very interesting. So point 6 is that behavior is influenced by both heredity and environment. And what this means is that behavior is influenced by both genetics and our environment. So when you hear people talk about the debate between nature or nurture, is it something you're born with or something that you learn over time? Is it your genes or is it your environment? What we're saying here is kind of spoiling the answer, and we're saying that behavior is a little bit of both. There are genes that influence our behavior, but we also have learned aspects that control behavior as well. So it's not usually one or the other. The answer is almost always both. And our last one is that people's experiences of the world is highly subjective. And what this means is that everybody is different. Everyone has different experiences and perceptions, and no one is going to experience the world exactly the same as anyone else. And so as a psychologist, we have to keep in mind that there are all these individual differences, and it makes it pretty hard to study some things. But again, our take home from all of this is that there's a lot that we should consider when we're trying to study different behaviors. There's lots of stuff to be aware of, and there's a lot of interconnected factors going on. So it might be a little bit harder to study psychology than one might originally assume.